Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life.
Diddy walked into the courtroom wearing the same sharp, tailored suit he had worn in dozens of public appearances. But there was no red carpet here, no flashing lights from adoring fans. The flashbulbs that had gone off outside belonged to reporters.
Quickly as possible. But what will he be sentenced to, really? That's the question. And also, will the government seize his assets? What about all of those civil lawsuits that he faces? Again, a lot of questions, a lot to get into. So for all of this, let me bring on former sex crimes prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, the great Matt Murphy is with us. Matt, good to see you.
Happy to be here, as always.
Got to ask you your reaction to the verdict. Is it what you expected?
Well, hearkening back to, I don't know, we were talking about this, you and I, a couple of months ago, and I gotta say, whether it's fun to be right or not in a case like this, we were both right. This was never a good fit for Rico for a lot of different reasons, and the consent element regarding the sex trafficking was always problematic. And I thought the prosecution here did a good job presenting their case. They did a good job presenting their theory. But when you match in a trial context, when you match like professorial and kind of plotting, which is the way a lot of government lawyers are, versus dynamic and engaging and that personality of the defense, it's always a mismatch. You're always up against it. And the Mann Act, like we talked about, I thought he was going down on that after like the second day of testimony. The problem is for the prosecution, the Mann Act is a very old law, and it was essentially legislative morality from about 100 years ago, where it was transporting prostitutes across state lines. The intent may have been good. It was essentially a very early version of sex trafficking, but it was really more an attempt to stop prostitution, which is, as we know, never going to happen. So almost every lonely guy in New York City who's going through a divorce, who is having a problem in the dating pool, who has some sex worker drive over from New Jersey, if he buys her Uber or his Uber, theoretically, that's a violation of the Mann Act. So that is it's not the same type of crime. There's no mandatory minimum under federal law. The judge does not have to.
That.
Right. They don't have to. Now, it carries up to 10 years per event. So he faces up to 20 years. The prosecution, I think, is asking for 46 months or something like that. They're asking for far less than that.
If they had called, let's say, Christina Courtroom, okay, this chief of staff who had been mentioned, I think, by almost every witness, and she said, hey, listen, there was a criminal enterprise, okay? We were all a part of it. Everybody knew what the job description was. My job was to do this. His job was to do this. You think they would have gotten racketeering? If they didn't include Jane, who was arguably the more problematic testimony, I mean, Sean Combs still paying her rent, messages that she was setting up a lot of these sexual encounters. Cassie had messages too that were problematic that showed, if we're talking about whether she was a willing participant or not. But if you focus just on Cassie and you didn't call in Jane, or you didn't call in Amia, or you didn't call in a Brianna Bengolan, if you limited the case, and now it's so easy to play, Monday morning quarterback or armchair lawyer here, but do you feel that the prosecution could have won this case if they structured it differently, if they called different witnesses?
That's a great question. And that's something that these prosecutors will literally be wondering for the rest of their lives, for the rest of their careers. They're going to be wondering if they'd done it different.
Photographers and news crews hungry for a glimpse of the moment. His walk was slow, measured, but anyone who had followed his career closely could see it: the stiffness in his shoulders, the subtle tightening around his jaw, the faint shadow under his eyes. He knew exactly what today meant. This was not a hearing. This was the day everything could change forever. He took his place at the defense table, his legal team already assembled, stacks of files and neatly arranged documents spread before them. The lawyer spoke in low tones, occasionally leaning in to murmur something in his ear, but his gaze remained fixed straight ahead. If he heard them, he didn't show it. The air inside the courtroom was thick. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Rows of reporters clutched notepads and recorders, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Former associates from the industry sat quietly in the back, some with their heads lowered, others watching intently as if they couldn't decide whether they were here for support or closure. The prosecution sat opposite.
And she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off. And I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of this particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they will say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and, obviously violence, they say, with Jane. But they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York. They made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago. But how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I mean, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, I mean, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And I think one of the good things and positive things that has come out of his incarceration is given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture, even,
organized and calm, their files stacked high but neatly aligned, their body language exuding quiet confidence. They had been building this case for years, brick by brick, until they felt the wall was high enough to stand on its own. And now, at last, the final act was here. The door behind the bench opened and the bailiff's voice cut through the hum of whispered conversation. Everyone rose to their feet as the judge entered. The sound of shuffling shoes and scraping chairs was quickly replaced by silence so deep you could almost hear the tension vibrating in the air. The judge sat, adjusted their glasses, and began to speak. Their tone was steady, deliberate, and without a hint of theatrics. They recapped the charges in meticulous detail, revisiting the timeline of events, the testimonies, and the evidence that had been laid out over the course of the trial. They spoke about the nature of influence, the responsibility that comes with it, and the devastating consequences when that responsibility is abused. Diddy's face was unreadable. His breathing was slow, controlled. Every so often, he would blink just a fraction.
Charges. So I think it does go to his credit, but you're right. Critics and skeptics, sometimes they'll just never be satisfied. And for, well-founded reasons. When you have someone who has a documented history such as him and you see the videos and you hear the testimony, his problem goes deeper than a 30-day, program. Not that these programs are 30 days, but just to say it's going to take long-term and commitment to the long-term results in order for us to really have confidence that he's not going to engage in such disturbing behavior.
And it's interesting too, because I think the public reaction to this verdict was really kind of split down the middle. I was really thinking it was going to be one way. I was at the courthouse. It was a completely different kind of beast and animal that was going on after the verdict happened. There were people with the baby oil. It was a crazy day after the verdict happened. But I know some analysts were kind of comparing it to the O.J. Simpson verdict, but it seemed like the reaction was really kind of split down the middle. A lot of people upset with the jury's decision, but then there were a lot surprisingly celebrating the verdict. What are your thoughts?
Well, my entire time looking at the case, the charges, and listening, to the evidence as it came in during trial, I thought that depending upon how a person, be it a juror, be it the public, comes into the trial believing how someone who's a victim should act and how they believe relationships can evolve or devolve and fall apart is the lens that they would then make their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting. You don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what? That's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side like
slower than normal, his expression unchanging as the weight of the judge's words filled the room. The judge spoke for several minutes, but to the people in the gallery, it felt much longer. Every word carried an edge. This was not a casual reprimand. This was a judgment being carved into stone. The language was formal, but the message was clear. The court saw the charges not just as legal violations, but as breaches of trust, violations of power, and acts that had ripple effects beyond the immediate parties involved. Then came the moment. The judge's voice shifted, adopting the tone of finality that only comes when the decision has already been made. They began to read out the sentence. The numbers rolled off their tongue slowly, deliberately, as though the syllables themselves carried weight. Years, not months, were being spoken, a span of time long enough to change a life forever. The gasp from the gallery was almost in unison. A murmur spread like a ripple across the room. Reporters' pens flying across pages, typing fingers racing to keep up. The sentence was harsher than many had anticipated. This wasn't a symbolic punishment, a slap on the wrist for a powerful figure. This was real time, time that would be lived out behind steel doors, under constant watch, in a world far removed from the luxury and influence Diddy had known for decades. And yet, Diddy didn't react. No outburst, no protest, no slamming of fists against the table. He remained still, frozen, his eyes locked forward. It was as if the words were echoing inside his mind, looping again and again, refusing to fade. His
trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. There were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we've got the First Amendment argument, as you mentioned, and the new trial argument. So all of those arguments, I think, are independent of, the issue you raised, which, but so we think we have a really strong motion. And so we're hoping the judge will agree. We'll see.
So just to be clear, I'll list out a couple of things that stood out to me when we were watching the trial. There was apparently this voice message that was played from Combs to Paul, right, one of the purported sex workers. "Hit me up when you close." There's a voice message. "Hey, Jeff."
His hands rested on the table, motionless. For a man known for his quick wit and command over any room, this silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. His lawyers leaned in quickly, their voices low but urgent. They spoke in rapid succession, likely about appeals, about options, about what could be done next. But Diddy didn't move. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He seemed suspended between the moment before the sentence and the reality that had just been handed down. The judge concluded their remarks, and the formality of the moment returned. The bailiff stepped forward, their movements precise and practiced. They had done this countless times before, but in this room, with this defendant, the gesture carried more weight. Diddy slowly stood. He adjusted his jacket, his hands lingering at the buttons for a second too long. As though grounding himself in the last few moments of freedom, the guards stepped closer, positioning themselves on either side. He took one slow breath, then began walking toward the side door that would take him away from the courtroom and into custody. In the gallery, the murmurs rose again. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. A man near the aisle shook his head slowly. Some faces showed sympathy, others satisfaction, and a few a kind of stunned disbelief, as if they couldn't quite process that the man who had stood atop the music industry for decades was now being led away in handcuffs. Outside, the news was already breaking. Headlines flashed across phones. Social media feeds flooded with reactions. Some posts were filled with shock, others with celebration, many with speculation.
That's the hill Diddy has to climb. Whether he climbs that hill or not remains to be seen. But it's definitely a hill that's in front of him. And some might say it's not a hill, it's a mountain.
It is a mountain for Diddy. I think it might honestly be Mount Everest. It's a large mountain for him to scale, for I think people to possibly forget in their conscious what we learned in this trial. And I remember when Sean Combs, we've been covering this since Cassie's lawsuit, since 2023, November of that year. And I just remember thinking that there would be some type of reckoning within the hip hop community, the Black community, as far as Me Too goes, something kind of similar. And I thought, possibly, and I think maybe other people thought so too, that maybe Sean Combs was kind of that person that would, bring about this kind of reckoning in the hip hop community as far as Me Too goes. But do you think that can still happen? Do you think that will still happen?
Well, I think that Diddy's trial, served as a clarion call, a wake up call, canary in the mine, so to speak, as it relates to you could be as powerful, as popular, as wealthy as Diddy. I mean, keep in mind, he called himself Brother Love. He got the key to New York City in
Yeah.
the months or the year leading up to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And he was sitting on what some might say is the highest pedestal. And look how far he has fallen.
Mhm.
Now, at the same time, you have that going on. And so people can look, if you really look at the case, and not just the legal case, but the case in the court of public opinion. And victims, if you will, won. Because he has, not only did he have a criminal case he had to deal with, but he has what, upwards of 20, 30 civil cases
I think
that
even
he's
more
also
than
going to have
that.
to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And each one of those cases, even if it's not proved by the victim that it happened, he is still going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees for each and every single case, and maybe millions for the more serious and those that get further down the line. So he's not done paying for his transgressions. And I think that for other people who are in similarly situated positions of power and influence, they certainly took notes from the Diddy trial and figured out, hey, if I continue to act like a pig,
Yeah.
pigs get slaughtered.
Yes, they do. And I just remember even in the outcome of the Sean Combs lawsuits that were filed, even probably before he was indicted, we were hearing and seeing more civil suits filed against other people. And even after this
Yes.
case, we've seen more high-profile figures have complaints against them, like Tyler Perry and Shannon Sharp and Smokey Robinson, all of which have denied the allegations against them. But I do think that a lot more people are willing to come forward, even if they're anonymous or even if they're willing to put their name out there too. But I'm curious, Adante, if you had a crystal ball, what are you expecting out of Diddy's October sentencing? Do you think it'll be kind of in the high max range or possibly on the lower end? I believe federal prosecutors are only asking for 4 years. The defense wants half of that, 2 years, possibly with a year of time served. So he could possibly be out next year around this time. But what are you expecting out of the sentencing?
Yeah, I don't see the judge giving him 4 or 5 years. If the prosecution asks for that time. So now that's kind of like the judge to go beyond that would have to find something that was aggravating in his mind to say, look, I'm going to give you more time than what the prosecution is even asking for. That doesn't happen, but it does happen at times. And it's pretty.
About what this meant for his career, his businesses, and the music world as a whole. Inside, the courtroom felt almost hollow without him. The energy that had charged the air when the session began had dissipated, replaced with a quiet finality. Lawyers gathered their papers. Reporters filed out quickly, already dialing their editors. For years, Diddy had built an empire, weathered scandals, and maintained a level of control over his image that few in the industry could match. But in this room, on this day, none of that mattered. The sentence was official. The decision was final. The man who once seemed untouchable was now bound by the same laws as everyone else, and his future would be spent far from the stages, studios, and boardrooms where he had made his name. It wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a dismantling of an identity. The mogul, the businessman, the cultural icon, all of those titles felt suddenly fragile, stripped away by a single reading of a sentence. What remained was a man walking toward a cell, carrying only the weight of the years ahead and the knowledge that his career might have just ended in that very room. As the heavy door closed behind him, the sound echoed through the courtroom, and with that sound, an era in hip-hop history may have closed as well.